Okay, good afternoon, everybody. At the outset, I thank Dr. Tushar Patil, Dr. Purvesh Parikh, and the entire ICON team for inviting me to chair this session and to conduct this session. Thank you very much. We have with us distinguished panel team consisting of pediatric oncologists, radiation oncologists, I think one more is awaited, and neurosurgeons. So let's begin. As all of you are aware of, childhood brain tumors is the commonest solid tumor as a group in children and constituting about 25% of all cancer in children. It is unfortunately one of the leading causes of mortality due to childhood cancer, and more important than that, significant long-term morbidity as a result of the tumor, as a result of the various treatment modalities that we use in young children. That's why we need to be very careful as to how we approach and manage these kids. During this panel discussion, we will be focusing on two of the most common cancers, brain tumors, medulloblastoma and low-grade glioma. And I think we'll begin. So are Dr. Ipari and Dr. Tejpal already on board? Yes, they're already on board. So let's begin with the first case. This is a 2.5-year-old male with a posterior fossa SOL with leptomeningeal dissemination. And the MRI showed 2.7 by 2.2 by 2.5 centimeter mass with obstructive hydrocephalus and nodular leptomeningeal deposits in the cranium as well as in the spinal canal. And this is the, these are the few of the images which we can see. And the small tumor in the posterior fossa and some of the meningeal enhancement, leptomeningeal enhancement. So let's begin by asking the first question to the neurosurgeon on the panel, Dr. Deshmukh. How would you approach this patient? What will be the general principles in management?
So for medulloblastoma, posterior fossa tumors, mostly they lie in fourth ventricular area, so approach is midline suboccipital craniotomy, and inside there are two approaches. One is called something called as telovelar approach, where you don't cut the vermis and go from the space below the vermis. So small tumor below 3 centimeters tumor, it's possible to avoid splitting the vermis. The another approach is called vermis splitting approach or transvermian approach. The tumor is, medulloblastoma is rarely stuck to the fourth ventricle, especially in the midline. So it's usually possible to do a gross total resection. Laterally, you can sacrifice structures, peduncles or things going into the cerebellum. Those which are not in midline, like previously called decimoplastic or VNT, those are in CP angle or in cerebellum. Nodular types. So those you approach either through CP angle retromastoid craniotomy or paramedian craniotomy.
No, the objective was you would go in, what would be the principle? We would go in with the intention of removing the tumor completely?
If you see the Kaplan-Meier curve, the actual resection, gross total resection does not have that much specific prognostic influence in some groups, but it has in some groups. Problem is that when you are operating, you don't know what tumor it is. So always the intention is to take out the tumor completely unless it is infiltrating in the fourth ventricle. And unlike ependymoma, medulloblastoma very rarely infiltrate into fourth ventricular floor.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sure. This child had hydrocephalus, and I can see.
Mic.
I can see that VP shunt was done. Is there any benefit of thinking about doing a third ventriculostomy?
Previously, we used to do preoperative third ventriculostomy or VP shunt. Now, what we do is we tap the ventricle during surgery, reduce the pressure, operate the tumor. At the end of surgery, I usually see aqueduct of Sylvian, the opening into fourth ventricle, clear it completely, put a small tube in third ventricle, clear out all the blood, and then at the end, I connect the tube, not in the third ventricle, but lateral ventricular tube to Ommaya reservoir, And if perioperatively he has, postoperatively he has leak or raised pressure, we can tap him for a couple of times. So usually in 2-3 weeks time, most of the hydrocephalus settles. So permanent shunt is needed less than 25%. So we try to avoid. Previously, even in my days in 90s, we used to first shunt the patient and then take for surgery. But invariably shunt is to get blocked because of bleeding during surgery. So we avoid shunting the patient in early stage or acute stage.
I think that's exactly what I was trying to bring up as well, that I think the days of doing a VP shunt automatically is no longer there. That you
Yeah,
kind of
almost,
usually done
almost we
post-op
try and
if-
avoid. We
if
try
there's
and avoid
persistent-
any
if there's
permanent hardware.
Yeah. So in this case, gross total resection was achieved, but this patient then developed post-op mutism and cranial nerve palsies. As you know, a more aggressive attempt to resection would land up with definitely a better, probably a better chance of cure, but at the cost of some significant neurocognitive sequelae. And we know that post-op mutism is an important risk factor for subsequent neurocognitive decline. So is there any specific technique you would use to consider to prevent these complications?
So exact etiology of mutism is not well documented, but it's postulated that transvermium approach, Vermian trauma, or pressure on superior and middle cerebral peduncle, or some cerebellar trauma. These are postulates. So whenever the tumor is small, sub 3 millimeter, 3 centimeter or 2.5 centimeter, we try through Tilloweller approach. And if we can't get to the top,
I'll just go to the next point, and then we can go back to this.
Yes, sure.
Is that overall subtotal resection has been shown to be an adverse prognostic factor, as seen here in these curves. But if you look at these data on the basis of the molecular subgrouping, we find that the 4 major subgroups like Wnt, SHH, group 3 and group 4, only the first 3, Wnt, SHH and group 3, there is no significant difference in the whether it has been a gross total or a near total or a subtotal resection. And only in group 4 patients is there are the adverse outcome. Now this grouping we would not know upfront.
at the time of surgery.
At the time of surgery, but there are MRI surrogates. But there are certain MRI surrogates, and maybe Dr. Tejpal, if they are connected online, would like to comment. How reliable do they think are these MRI surrogates in their practice?
So, thank you, Dr. Shailesh, and I just want to again reinforce that VP shunts are not necessary in today's age, and surgical resection of the tumor re-establishes the CSF flow and relieves the obstruction. So that's the best thing to do, and I agree with both the neurosurgeons when they say that shunt should be reserved only if there is persistent hydrocephalus. As far as MRI is concerned, I think as of today, I don't think the radiogenomics of medulloblastoma in terms of interpreting them from MRI scans is very, very robust and can be practiced clinically. I think we are some time away from that kind of a scenario. Having said that, I think at our institute at Tata Memorial Center, we have been doing this, and we've also published our results on this using MRI features to predict molecular subgrouping. It's easier for the SHH and the group 4 medulloblastoma. It's not so easy for the Wnt and the group 3 medulloblastoma. So in short, I would say that in clinical practice, I think it is very difficult to just use them very, very confidently, because the accuracy is not so good. The accuracy, overall accuracy is around 70%. It is less than 60% for Wnt and group 3, and it is around 80% for SHH and group 4 medulloblastoma. But for the neurosurgeons, I think their paradigm still remains maximal safe resection. So within the confines of safety, I think whatever they can remove maximally. Even the Thompson paper that you just now showed, that clearly shows that as opposed to a GTR, NTR, STR in group 4 medulloblastoma is associated with worse outcomes. So STR in group 4 is something that should be avoided, but I think the neurosurgeons have to go by the limits of safety. So, and preoperatively, of course, they cannot rely just on the MRI for molecular subgroup.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Just a short query, again back to the, Dr. Deshmukh. There are certain protocols where we would like to use intraventricular chemotherapy. And in a patient with an in situ VP shunt, would that be a contraindication, or do I need to modify? Do I need to remove the shunt?
So at our centers, we have not used for medulloblastoma intraventricular therapy, but there are devices nowadays available which have those shunts have switch on, switch off mechanism. Or if you have programmable shunt, you can raise the pressure very high so that subsequent spillage stops. So two things are achieved. Was first, you can give the intraventricular therapy methotrexate and hold it in ventricle for some time. And as patient starts developing symptoms of raised ICP, you open the valve and let it go. There are button valves also available. We haven't used it. So that's the main reason why we avoid shunt and we put a OMI reservoir. It's a tube in ventricle with a subcutaneous subscalp chamber where you can repeatedly aspirate or inject drugs or CSF, and that we use routinely, OMI reservoir.
Sure. Okay, so we move ahead on the case. This was the histopathology. It is a classic medulloblastoma, grade 4, and synoptophysin, new N, beta-catenin membrane positivity, P53 c-MYC positive, and a MIB of 60 to 70%. So coming to Shantanu, how would you stratify this patient?
So classification of medulloblastoma actually nowadays has gone to almost completely on a molecular basis, but the basic principles remains the same, and you look at a few things. You look at the age of the patient. If the patient's age is more than 3, then that falls into a standard or low risk. Anybody who's below 3 will automatically go to a high risk. Similarly, you look at metastasis. Any mets pushes the patient into a high risk category, be it nodular mets or be it like spinal micromets that you're picking up on your MRI scan. Resection, so you look at post-operative, we need to have another MRI to check what's the tumor volume that has been left behind. And we can look at when's the best time to do the MRI, possibly about 48 hours to 72 hours post-surgery might be the best time, or very late. So you can't really leave it till the next week, because by that time you'll have post-operative increase in the tissue swelling, and that will make things quite complicated. So really early MRI is very useful for these patients, and that would tell me what is the residual tumor volume. And what we are looking at is about 1.5 centimeters squared, 1.5 by 1.5. If it is less than that, then we have a very good resection, and that patient falls into a good risk category. Anything more than that means there's residual disease. But again, we talked about right now in various groups, probably the prognosis of having a little bit of disease left behind, it's not quite so much important right now with molecular subtypes coming in so very aggressively. And finally, we can look at the histopathology, and if there's classical or desmoplastic, that's standard low risk, but if we have anything like anaplasia or large cell, that's high risk. And then finally, we have to look at molecular subtypes, and I won't go into that because that's a completely different thing, and I'm sure
So in your practice, with this data, what would you be classifying this as?
Just by age itself, high risk.
Okay. So,
And meds.
Dr. Datta, would you like to add anything? Right, sure. Okay. So, next question, I would like to involve Dr. Ipari. How useful do you consider molecular subtyping in clinical practice? Now, it's very useful in a trial setting, but like centers like mine, which have just standalone treatments, should we be doing molecular subtyping in all our patients with medulloblastoma? And how would it subsequently affect the management? That I would like Dr. Shantanu and Dr. Tejpal to comment on. So, Dr. Ipari, are you there?
Yeah, Dr. Shailesh, are
Yeah.
you able to hear me?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
First of all, like in this case, what Dr. Sanpul had elaborated, that it's a metastatic disease. In cases of metastatic disease, I think the molecular grouping has a little bit limited in the sense to stratify as a high risk or very high risk. So only to stratify between risk or very high risk, you might require a molecular grouping if you want to follow the current risk stratification, which has overruled the molecular subgrouping or historical grouping. Yes, maybe in certain subtyping, like in the Wnt molecular group, if it is a Wnt type, then we cannot really classify in what stratification you can go. Because if you want to have an integrated molecular grouping, metastatic Wnt is not still stratified in any of the risk categories. It's been classified as unknown. Probably in those conditions, you need to take the clinical features, residual and metastatic feature, and with that feature, you might have to stratify as a high risk. But in a non-metastatic setting, you require molecular if you want to stratify in this stratification, as well as in infantile. I do completely agree with Dr. Shantanu's points, like, all infantile less than 3 years medulloblastoma or high risk, where there are good subset of infantile SHH has very good risk protection. Though your treatment options might be limited, but still, if you want to practice situation. Yes, it's true what you said, like residual amount is really not taken so much in account for the final risk stratification. It is a molecular group, clinical findings, especially metastatic, non-metastatic, and to some extent histological subtype. The Larsen anaplastic subtyping, if you have it, it goes into high risk, then it's an SHH type, or in cases of group 3, probably group 4 and Wnt Larsen anaplastic, we cannot really classify what it is. So maybe in your scenario, in this case, probably I see very little scope for further adding to risk stratification by molecular.
Now, so in current practice, outside a clinical trial, are you routinely doing molecular subtyping and then modifying treatment based on that? What is the practice?
I think Dr. Tejpal is there.
Yeah.
We do routinely all molecular subgrouping, and how much is it affecting the clinical management? I think Tejpal will be the best.
Yeah, Dr. Tejpal can please come in.
So
You
I
come.
think first for this case, I don't think there's, I mean, this is the management won't change really speaking, because it was metastatic to begin with. That is what
Right,
showed
right.
on the scan and the images. But I think currently we may not be changing practice. You are right. I mean, we still go by the conventional sort of risk stratification using the presence of metastasis and the presence of residual tumor more than 1.5 centimeters square to decide treatment. But as Sridhar said, for the last close to 10 years now, we've been doing molecular subgrouping on all medulloblastoma patients, and since the last 5 years actually in being offered as a service at Tata Hospital through the molecular pathology lab. So we do change treatment when the patient is enrolled in a clinical trial. So we have currently an ongoing clinical trial of de-escalation in Wnt pathway medulloblastoma. We also have a clinical trial of adjuvant combat after completing standard therapy in high-risk medulloblastoma. So those are molecularly defined trials, but I think it's unless you start doing molecular subgrouping, you will not be ready when the time comes to change practice based on molecular subgrouping. So currently outside of clinical trials, I think most patients would be treated with the standard of care treatment based on conventional clinico-radiological stratification. But I think increasingly people are realizing that we should have access to molecular subgrouping, and if the clinical trials do demonstrate either improvement, whether it is de-escalation for Wnt or further escalation for group 3 or metastatic medulloblastoma, I think you will need to incorporate that into routine clinical practice.
No, I agree completely, because it's very attractive to think that if you have a patient who's a Wnt positive, then if you could de-escalate the therapy for such a patient, we'd get less morbidity, possibly less mortality for them.
Yes, Dr. Datta, what is the practice with your...
I see. We as of
Correct,
now, the
correct.
molecular
So for
subtype
Wnt
is not
positive,
changing the
yeah.
practice.
St. Jude's
So-
probably they have started doing. Sorry. No, I'm saying that we're saying that St. Jude's probably has done something like that. That if they had find that it's a medulloblastoma, non-metastatic, Wnt positive, so they're looking at whether they can get radiotherapy out for Wnt positive tumors.
But I
it's
believe
still
I
very early
believe the
clinical
study has been terminated
Yeah,
and
correct.
because of
Absolutely.
increased relapses in
Correct.
that.
So that's
it's
why
still
I think it's,
the verdict
yeah,
is not
that's
out.
been terminated.
No, no,
yeah.
but that's not the St. Jude's study that was terminated. That's the Johns Hopkins study on Wnt
Okay.
pathway medulloblastoma that was terminated, where they eliminated completely radiotherapy. It was a primary chemotherapy approach in Wnt medulloblastoma.
Right, yeah.
We had started also a study in Wnt medulloblastoma, a prospective study where we were doing only focal radiotherapy plus chemotherapy. We also had to terminate the study because there were excessive relapses in outside the treated tumor bed. So all these things have to be done in the context of a clinical trial. You cannot just change the treatment just because you get some molecular subtype in clinical practice.
Okay, so that mostly answers the next question I actually wanted to ask Dr. Ipari. Would IHC be a clue to the molecular subtype? Can you just quickly give us some idea on this? And
Yes, studies have shown good concordance, but it will not really help in final certification because only by doing the panel of IHC by using TAP1, beta-catenin, filamin A, and can it has been shown that, but you need to add at least an NMIC to study amplification and certain other chromosomal variations like chromosome 6 loss and chromosome 11 can help you to stratify. What is the concerns of more two orthogonal methods of subtyping which to determine your treatment intervention? That's what treatment strategy. So currently we are not, nobody says recommendation that IHC alone is enough. Probably we have to take it a little bit in there. Probably you can use radiological features, IHC as well as fish. Probably you can do that.
okay, thank you. I'll just skip the next slide. Go directly to Dr. Shantanu and Dr. Tejpal. What would be the overall treatment plan for this 2.5-year-old child with metastatic disease? Dr. Shantanu
Sorry,
first,
so,
and then Dr. Tejpal.
So if I just start off a little bit to say that because the child is below 2.5 years, I mean, we know that radiotherapy is possibly one of the best options that we can offer our patients as a modality of cure for medulloblastoma. But at 2.5 years, the amount of side effects and long-term neurocognitive effects that would result are probably a bit too much. So at least at this age, I would prefer chemotherapy as the first line of therapy. And we have various protocols that we use. I mean, good old Packer is there and Head Start, etc., which basically my plan would be to give chemotherapy to control the disease. And one of the options might be to take the patient till he's about 3 years of age. And at that point, certainly I would be approaching Dr. Tejpal to say that, is this a good time to think about radiotherapy? I would really appreciate Dr. Tejpal's.
So yeah, I mean,
input.
would you continue chemotherapy till 3 years and then wait for progression to decide radiation, or would you
So my practice,
automatically radiate at 3 years?
So my practice has been to continue on with chemotherapy and wait to see if there's progression. Certainly at that point, we would refer for radiotherapy.
So I have some disagreement there. So, I mean, of course, we can't start with craniospinal in a 2.5-year-old child despite the metastatic status. I think the benefit-risk ratio is not so much in favor. We would certainly give pre-radiation chemotherapy, but we would do planned craniospinal irradiation after 6 months of chemotherapy at the age of 3 years. I mean, I agree there's nothing magical about the 3 year. I mean, we sometimes do at 2 year, 10 months, 2 year, 11 months also. So we do periodic scans while the patient is on pre-radiation chemotherapy, and if there is any progression, then of course we would start the craniospinal earlier rather than wait till 3 years. But this is an easier scenario because the child is 2.5 years, 6 months of chemo, and then you can actually get on to the craniospinal irradiation. The problem is if the child is a 1-year-old child, what do you do then? And if it's a non-metastatic setting, this is clearly metastatic, so I would have no hesitation whatsoever to jump onto craniospinal irradiation immediately after 3 years, or if there is progression even before 3 years. The problem is in a year and a half old child, non-metastatic disease, how long can you push the chemotherapy, and what would be the best option for chemotherapy? Unless you're giving really high dose methotrexate and intraventricular therapy and all that stuff, I think it's very difficult with conventional chemotherapy to keep the disease at bay for a very long time. So that's more of a challenge rather than this one. This is somewhat easier.
So would you consider focal radiation in that situation, a 1.5-year-old with
Yeah,
non-metastatic
this we've
disease?
this we've debated ad nauseum, and sometimes we've done that. Sometimes I must accept that and admit that we've done that, but very occasionally after discussing everything with the parents. So I think parental consent for that kind of a focal radiotherapy approach for a child who hasn't attained 3 years of age, I think very occasionally we have done that. I mean, I can probably count maybe 4 or 5 kids in the last 10, 12 years.
Okay. So we know that desmoplastic tumors do very well and metastasis is rare. But in the rare event of having a desmoplastic histology with a metastatic disease, would you, Dr. Datta, consider a lower dose radiation at 3 years rather than the 36 gray
No,
that you would?
actually it has not shown any data to reduce the dose. Actually, it has shown that there is an increase of recurrences if you reduce the dose. So we don't reduce the dose in terms of desmoplastic.
Irrespective of whether it's
irrespective of
desmoplastic
the
or
molecular
anything, you would
subtyping and-
not. The other question now, of course, is with the availability of proton. We know that a lot of other side effects like auditory side effects, endocrine side effects, and so on would reduce. But the whole brain would still receive a 36 gray equivalent. So would that in any way be associated with a lower neurocognitive decline than conventional radiation? Dr. Datta and then Dr. Deshpal also would.
See, even in proton, the whole brain is going to receive the appropriate dose, either 23 gray or 36 gray, depending on the stratifications, high risk or intermediate risk. So that may not reduce the neurocognitive dysfunction, but dose to the kidney, dose to the heart, dose to the other parts, small intestines, that is going to reduce.
Yes, definitely.
So the extracranial toxicities are going to be reduced with proton. Cognitive function, I'm not sure it is good. There is no data to compare between in cognitive function assessment.
Yes, there are some papers which say that it's a little better, but in most of those studies, the children have been a little older, around 7, 8 years old, where we know that the neurocognitive effects are not going to be as drastic as younger children. So we'll just go through things very fast because we are going short of time. Recurrent medulloblastoma, Dr. Shantanu, would you treat with a curative or a palliative intent?
A recurrence of medulloblastoma, it's very difficult to say whether I treat with a curative or palliative, but it's basically any recurrence is bad news. Now, the only things I could say is that if we have not used due to whatever reason radiation the first time, and if it's a very young child, and by this time when the tumor comes back and the child's more than 3, draw a line wherever, then certainly that would be the first thing that you really, really need to treat the child with. We have other options. I mean, we've been playing around with high-dose therapy with autologous stem cell rescue for medulloblastoma for quite a long time, and there are certain groups who really believe it. The Americans are big proponents of doing autologous transplants. Europeans certainly a little bit less so. Germans don't do it quite a lot. But if it hasn't been used in the first time, we can think about using that. And after that, if we have the option of thinking newer drugs, monoclonals, that might be something we can think of. And certainly what I cannot get away from is speaking to my surgeons again and seeing that if there is any possibility of doing a second surgery, even if it's not going to be full, I would really appreciate your thoughts.
So we are a little skeptical operating again in early recurrence or immediate post-therapy recurrence. But there are certain late recurrences like 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. In those cases, especially if there is solitary recurrence in the operated field, then we are aggressive in excising the tumor. Usually it is again in cerebellum or vermis, and you can take out the tumor. Prognosis is not as good as the first surgery and chemo radiation. But I think excision adds to the overall treatment.
The issue of re-radiation is there. Like a patient has already received craniospinal radiation and maybe a year or two later, So what do we how do we decide who can receive radiation? What is the time gap that you would need before you would consider this, Dr. Datta?
See, medulloblastoma, we don't have a lot of series which have re-radiation done. So there are only small series which we have. And it is at DFI that determines that whether we are going to go for a full dose of radiations, because if you really want to treat again in a recurrent setting after the surgery is done, we need to give the full dose of radiations. So it is the time period between the first treatment and the recurrence that actually determines. And usually we try to do as much possible as the actual dosing, 23.6 gray to the CSI and with a boost. So as close as possible, depending on the total brain dose is 100 gray, what we know. So depending on the DFI, the decay in the dose, and then we plan according to the dose.
Okay. So we can move on to the.
Dr. Shailesh, can
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just-
Dr. Deshpal, please come in. Yeah.
So, a couple of quick points regarding recurrent medulloblastoma. I think what Dr. Shantanu said, if a child has been adequately treated at upfront diagnosis, recurrent medulloblastoma, it's a non-curative situation. The only curative situation is if the child has not received radiation upfront at initial diagnosis for whatever reason. Then recurrent progressive medulloblastoma you can still salvage. Having said that, I think the disease-free interval, the type of recurrence, whether it is a local recurrence or it is a disseminated disease, and also the molecular subgrouping sometimes can sort of determine how aggressive you should be and consider re-excision as well as re-irradiation and salvage chemotherapy, which can provide meaningful prolongation of life. Of course, unlikely to be curative in nature. So a longer disease-free interval, a group 4 molecular subgrouping and a localized sort of a pattern of relapse, they are much more amenable to a longer term survival with aggressive multimodality salvage therapy.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll move to the next case quickly. This is again a 1-year-old female who initially presented to a pediatric gastroenterologist for persistent vomiting and failure to thrive. It was the development of nystagmus which directed him to the CNS pathology, and this is the tumor. So we have a supracellular tumor, well circumscribed. Yeah, Dr. Deshmukh, how would you approach the surgical management?
So, sorry, but I must say that images are insufficient to decide.
I agree.
I have gone through the slides and I
just-
know the diagnosis.
Yeah.
So, usually in this area, obviously low-grade glioma, looking at the T2 hyper is commonest thing, but you need to study contrast pattern, T1 diffusion, and we usually do cis sequence to see relation to optic chiasma infiltration into hypothalamus. And things
Chiasma
like
is
that.
infiltrated in this case.
Yeah, so you can say that it's infiltrated, pituitary is little separate. So this is optic pathway hypothalamic glioma mostly. There is something called as Dodge classification where the relation of the tumor to the optic apparatus, pre-chiasmatic, chiasmatic, post-chiasmatic is taken into account. So if it is unilateral pre-chiasmatic, definitely you try to completely exclude the disease, send frozen as you reach the chiasma till the tumor borders are clear. Most of the cases usually present unfortunately with chiasmal or hypothalamic infiltration, and nowadays what we practice is upfront chemotherapy. We don't, if it is definitively on the radiology, definitive to be OPHG, then we usually do not take biopsy. In classical cases, we start upfront chemotherapy. If the tumor is big, its patient is presenting with diencephalic syndrome, then you may try to debulk. But what is recommended is try chemo and see if there is central necrosis. Then you can go intrahemispheric and just remove the necrosed part or something around that also, keeping the borders intact. And sometimes they present with hydrocephalus, then it is wiser in these patients to do immediate shunt because they will be shunt dependent. In those cases, you cannot postpone or avoid shunt. So early shunting is recommended if patient presents with hydrocephalus in these cases.
Okay, so as you said, a biopsy may not be done. So just like to...
Especially in NF1 group, we don't recommend.
Yes, in
biopsy.
NF1 I agree, but in other, sporadic OPG,
If it is
would you...
atypical, last year we did one biopsy. He had an atypical. He was not a pediatric case, adult case, non-NF. So we did a biopsy. It was a little atypical. But usually, if you study the images carefully with radiologist and see sequence and everything, you can see the stresses going along the optic pathway posteriorly, and that most of the time confirms the diagnosis.
So, Dr. Ipari, same question to you. What additional information would we really get from a biopsy? And do we really need to do molecular characterization in the current
as
situation?
of now, nothing. Only we suppose if you are targeting, giving an option of targeted therapy, you want to know whether it's a BRAF V600 mutant tumor or non-V600 mutant tumor. So depending upon your therapeutic indication, like I don't see any reason to do a biopsy. Typically looks like low optic pathway glioma. So maybe in certain clinical scenarios, like it is recurrent or fast growing or not a typical radiology. If you have any element of doubt for high grade, probably in those instances, but otherwise, typical optic pathway, I don't see. If baseball has something to add more, but as a pathology wise, I don't see.
As Sridhar, as oncologists, we always want tissue diagnosis and molecular grouping. So we are happy if somebody does a biopsy, but I agree. I mean, it's not entirely necessary. If you are reasonably confident of a clinical radiological diagnosis in a 2-year, 3-year-old child, I think you can start chemotherapy right away without a tissue diagnosis.
So, in just outside this case scenario, the patient may have undergone some surgery and we have tissue for diagnosis. So, in this situation, would you like to do some molecular typing or?
Yeah, yes, we should characterize what type of alteration it is having, like whether. So most of these gliomas are MAP kinase pathway activated tumors. Either in almost like more than 90% of the time it is the either BRAF V600 or BRAF fusions. There are certain fusions called. So the frequency of V600 mutation in suprasellar is relatively higher than this other cerebellar location. Maybe in that scenario you can do, but I don't see as of now that the molecular alteration will change your clinical course. I don't see anything. Only in cases of like specific targeted therapy institution, probably that is also probably in the kind of relapse setting, or maybe when you exhaust your first line of therapy. In that scenario, you might require the baseline characterization.
So, Dr. Shantanu, how do you go about managing this patient? I hope we have a couple of minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, we'll try to wind up. So quickly, broad guidelines.
So basically, start off with chemotherapy. It's pretty standard low-grade glioma protocol with vincristine, carboplatin, and you continue that and see how the patient is. I can see your patient has stable disease, then progressed after 8 to 9 months. So at that point, you kind of decide how you want to take forward. There are various other chemo protocols which have other newer drugs that you can use in combination.
Would you consider another chemo? Would you consider attempted surgery, or would you consider radiation?
I would certainly consider a second surgery if it has not been done. And so just to say that there are now a few molecular targets there which it's useful to explore. Certainly if you have a V600E, there is a target, there's a marker that's a marker for which we have a monoclonal antibody, and it's been coming into clinical practice, though it's very, very new, and that might be something you can look at to use. Other than that, if your patient has tuberous sclerosis, then that's another subgroup of patients which have mTOR inhibitors have been shown to be very, very useful. And you may not even need chemotherapy for that subgroup of patients. Just put them on sorafenib, and your tumor can regress just with simple medication like that.
Okay, just the last question, I'll just give some background. We have some data, there's some data published regarding the long-term outcomes of low-grade gliomas in children, and what we can see the 20-year-old overall survival is very good, almost 90%. But there is this study which showed that there is an increased risk of late deaths in the radiated patients, and it has been seen that there have been no deaths because of tumor progression after 5 years from diagnosis, indicating that there is probably some plateauing in the growth of these tumors. And hence, the authors recommended that one should avoid radiation as much as possible for these kids because their long-term outcome is going to be very good. On the contrary, there is this paper from Neuro-Oncology from St. Jude's where they did a study on those patients who had received radiation and they identified low and high risk categories. The high risk was the diffuse astrocytomas or the tumors in thalamus and midbrain. And there they said the delayed RT, that is either after more than one cycle of chemotherapy, the delayed RT in the high risk group was associated with a further decrease in the overall survival. So at this time, Dr. Tejpal, the last question, when would you consider radiation for such children with hypothalamic chiasmatic tumors? At any time, when would you consider it specifically?
So I would just like to qualify the conclusion and interpretation of the paper from the sick kids which showed 20-year OS of 90% and detriment in survival with radiotherapy. We always have to remember that only the worse biology or the bad biology tumors undergo radiation therapy, not the good biology ones. So there is a significant selection bias there. Having said that, I think we also want to avoid radiotherapy as far as practicable. We certainly start off with one line of chemotherapy, which is generally the vincristine carboplatin. If patients progress on that, it is the second line is generally single agent vinblastine. When two lines are exhausted, I think and targeted treatment is not an viable option, then we would offer radiotherapy. We have to remember that the 5-year progression-free survival for any low-grade glioma protocol chemotherapy is only about 40%. So in 5 years' time, 40% of children will progress with whatever line of first-line chemotherapy you have used. But as you pointed out, there is after a certain period of time after the child attains the age of whatever 12 years, 14 years, 15 years, maybe when the child reaches puberty or in the post-pubertal range, the tumor does not necessarily grow any further. So I think if you can take the child till that post-pubertal or pubertal age group with chemotherapy, salvage chemotherapy, second line, third line, maybe you would not need the radiation therapy. But if the child is progressing early, then we would definitely consider for radiation therapy.
Okay.
We don't go beyond 2 cycles of salvage chemotherapy. I mean, at the third progression, we would give sort of radiation.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Tejpal. And are there any further comments from anybody in the panel? So we would then conclude this session. I must admit that this has been quite a very informative activity for me, and I thank the organizers once again for giving me this opportunity. I thank the panelists for their contribution, and I hand over the mic to the organizer.